Hey everyone, welcome to the 19th episode of the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable brought to you by FantasyLabs. I'm Matthew Freedman, the editor-in-chief, and we have a special episode for you. As you know, the NFL regular season is starting soon, and NFL DFS is a big deal here at FantasyLabs, but we also focus on other sports. Golf and MLB are in season right now. We have the NBA product. That's something that we're very proud of. So in this episode, we're going to look at those other sports and talk about the lessons or principles that can be applied from non-NFL DFS in general to the NFL. And joining us for this episode are three heavy hitters at FantasyLabs. One of them is Colin Davy at ADJ Baseline, Adjusted Baseline. He's the director of the golf product at FantasyLabs and the two-time winner of the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference Hackathon. Colin, welcome back to the show.
I'm actually excited to be here with the rest of the product heads. I know golf is kind of like one of the probably the least known or least popular of all four. So this is kind of like that moment in Thanksgiving when you're 10 years old and you graduate from the Fisher-Price table to the adults. So this is how I know I've really arrived. So thanks, everyone, for letting me be in the presence of everybody's real sports over here.
Yeah, and thanks for letting me be the servant who gets to serve the table. That's something that I really enjoy.
I prefer dark meat to leg meat for my turkey leg, if that's cool with you.
No, but it doesn't really.
I just can't be choosers.
Okay, anyway, it's good to have you back. Also returning to the show, we have Justin Phan. And Justin, it seems like it's been months since you've been on the show. Obviously, everyone can follow him on Twitter at JFan. He's a managing director at FantasyLabs and the guy who handles all the day-to-day work on the NBA and MLB products. Justin, are you ready to give some hot takes?
Oh, they're piping hot. I've been saving these for months now. It's been a while since I've been on a pod, a video, anything. I'm just ready to dish them out and, ready to have Colin join the big hitters. And, Bales and I have shown him how it's done, 5 to 10 minutes of prep, solid prep beforehand, and let's get rolling.
I have to say you have the microphone for it, so you are ready to go. Okay, and then finally we have returning to the roundtable for, I believe it's his second appearance, the boss man, Jonathan Bales at Bales Football. He's a co-founder of FantasyLabs, the founder of Roto Academy, a DraftKings analyst, and the author of the Fantasy Sports for Smart People books. And actually one of those just came out today, I believe, so that's pretty exciting. He's the guy who oversees everything product related on a macro level. Jonathan, are you excited for football?
I am. I just released the book today. I'm excited about that. And I think this is my first ever pod with not only Colin, but I think Justin. Is that right?
I think we did one really early, but I don't want to forget it.
Yeah, there was a roundtable pod where you guys were cuddled in
the fireplace.
Yeah, I remember that one.
I don't think Justin does remember that.
I remember, parts of it.
That was one to forget.
It was actually a good episode, but it's one that isn't remembered all that well by some people on the staff. Okay, let's jump into it. NFL DFS. How does it compare to other sports, golf, NBA, and MLB DFS? And what can we take from these other sports that can make us better as NFL DFS players? So let's start there. And Colin, let's start with you. Big picture, and this is really the dumbest question ever. How is golf DFS similar to NFL DFS, and how is it different?
Well, I, of course, appreciate you saving the dumbest question for me, batting leadoff. That's standard operating procedure. I think it's easy to start with how golf is different because it is kind of a unique animal, even compared to all the other sports. The big factors, the pricing is radically different. It's odds-based, so it's kind of forward-looking instead of backward-looking. And there are no positions, so there's a lot less constraints. And it's an individual sport, so you don't have the typical sources of value you might find in basketball and football, mainly in backups play. So it really forces you to kind of dig deep and figure out what does value actually mean in PGA DFS. And a lot of times, not only what is really similar and is kind of exaggerated that applies to NFL absolutely is that these notions of consistency, upside, and range of outcomes. You can, like, when I first started playing other sports, I kind of understood that there were concepts that, maybe they're important beyond just simple projections, and you kind of need to incorporate them in game types and all of that. In golf, it's not optional, because you have this factor, the cut, where just the scoring differences between players are so drastic because half the field gets eliminated every Friday. Imagine if NFL had a rule saying if a quarterback doesn't throw for at least 100 yards in the first half, he's automatically benched. We'd be approaching NFL DFS completely differently. And these notions of consistency, we'd be hammering home a lot more than we already are. So as someone who kind of, was slow to really integrate the notion of range of outcomes into, roster construction, golf really forced me to think critically about, okay, what is consistency? What is upside? And you really see not only how non-optional it is, but you start working on how to quantify it. And I think that's the best applicability to NFL.
Justin, Jonathan, do either of you guys have, kind of from the outsider's perspective, someone who's not into it nearly as much as Colin is, but someone who still appreciates golf and plays it, any perspective on PGA DFS and how it applies to NFL?
The one thing that I'll say that Colin touched on a bit is that because it's such an individual sport, there's also not really correlations. There's some with the weather and tee times, but there's not the same correlations that we have certainly in MLB and a bit in NFL. And then the main thing that was so shocking to me that I just didn't believe at first, because it's not really the case in most sports, is how much recent performance can matter in golf. It's a really big thing. And I think that, a golfer's last month or 6 weeks of production, fantasy production, or adjusted round score are really predictive. Whereas in NFL and MLB, those are sports that you generally, I think, want to get away from those situations. The players that a lot of people perceive as hot, it's just really difficult to tell if that's the case. And then in tournaments, because ownership gets inflated, it's almost certainly not the case that those guys offer sort of usable value.
All right, Justin, let's go to you. Just talk about NBA DFS. How's it similar to and different than NFL DFS? It looks like you are muted.
Yeah, I think on the four sports we're mentioning, we're talking about on this roundtable, NBA and NFL DFS are the most similar because they're team-oriented. You have a finite amount of players on the court or field at the same time, competing for the same playing time and usage. And you look at NBA, the stats that are the most highly correlated with DFS scoring are field goal attempts, free throw attempts, points, and minutes. And NFL, we kind of see a similar trend. Attempts and touches being the most highly correlated for running backs, targets and receptions for receivers. So that means that your process for both sports just should revolve around projecting minutes, snaps, and workload. And that involves not only staying on top of injuries and reports from beat writers for indications on what we should expect, but also paying attention to game scripts. And not just in the traditional sense, but in terms of looking how NBA coaches' rotations change when they're ahead or behind by a large margin, or how significantly a team's pass-run split differs based on the scoring margin. Another thing that's a little bit thinner that applies more to NFL is that I think Vegas lines for NFL are a great way to gain an edge in GPPs. I think Vegas is kind of already priced into NFL, and it really affects ownership significantly, where people kind of overvalue that. And I think it's, presents a really plus EV spot to kind of fade the players in the highest total games and target those in kind of the next tier below. And that's kind of something I look to do in NBA a little bit is, there are really juicy spots and really, heavy hitters at a position like point guard, Steph Curry, Russell Westbrook, that people gravitate towards. I can change things up and go a tier a little below and play like a John Wall. It still has that, kind of elite ceiling, but, isn't one of those guys that commands high ownership and you can get a little bit of a discount. I think the biggest difference between NBA and NFL DFS is the consistency and variance from game to game. You also have a smaller sample size. It kind of forces you to make a lot more assumptions in NFL than you would in NBA. you kind of, NBA teams play each other, quite a few times each year. You have a track record. You have, a sample to look at to make, pretty accurate judgments off of. And NFL, things can really change dramatically from week to week, depending on a lot of factors.
That's some great stuff there. Jonathan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that the big thing that Justin hit on is that NBA is so consistent. We really can project floors and ceilings pretty well in that sport relative to NFL. It's just very, very difficult. Even though we can do it, it's not with the same sort of consistency. The one thing that is the same from NBA to NFL are that you at times can have just auto start guys, even in tournaments, regardless of ownership, you just play those guys. In NBA, it's definitely more obvious, where there's a min price guy and he's just going to get a ton of minutes. But the equivalent in NFL would be a backup running back who's min priced and the starter gets hurt after pricing comes out and he's just an auto play. And that's not the type of player that I think you want to be contrarian around. You just plug him in and then try to differentiate around that.
No, Jonathan, I think you had said at one point that although obviously NFL is a sport that you really enjoy, MLB is actually your best DFS sport. I don't know if I'm remembering that correctly, but can you talk about how MLB is similar to and different than NFL?
Yeah, I think it's my best. It's my favorite just because I think that I'm a player that doesn't try to necessarily out-predict other players in terms of on-field performance. I mean, obviously everyone's trying to do that, but I don't think that that's necessarily the major edge as much as trying to out-predict what other people are going to do and maybe inefficiencies in the way that they're thinking or likely to construct lineups, and then ways that I can exploit that. And I think that comes down to just variance and volatility. And that's one reason that I don't play NBA as much. It's definitely a predictable sport, but it's predictable for everyone. And so I think it sets up really well for cash games and not as much for me for tournaments as someone who's a contrarian player. As far as NFL, that same volatility exists between football and baseball. It's probably more so in baseball, especially with batters, but in NFL you still have it's such an event-based sport. You have touchdowns and just big plays that could go either way. In baseball you have home runs that could have got caught at the warning track, and so it's just a very difficult sport to predict. And so for that reason, I think that in both of them you want to try to sort of embrace that uncertainty, or at least that's the way that I approach it. And I would say that volatility also leads to both of them being sports that recent performance, like I said, isn't really necessarily that predictive of a thing. And a lot of times you want to get away from the guys who are hot or jump on guys who are performing down, assuming their role hasn't changed. And then you have the correlations that I talked about. I think that the differences would be that baseball is not a time sport. And so the teammates sort of have, there's theoretically infinite scoring. Everything good that happens for one player on a team is necessarily good for everyone else on their team. In football, you don't have that, obviously. There's some correlation that we can take advantage of, but a touchdown for any non-quarterback is a bad thing for every other non-quarterback on his team. And so there's a little bit of cannibalization there, I think. And then in baseball, the Vegas lines are very, very important. I think it sort of relates to that because it's untimed. Whereas in football, situations change so much, and it really is a situation-specific sport that's maybe not solved in the same way as baseball. Baseball is such a solved game, and the stats really, really mean something, and we know what they mean. We know how good players are. We don't know that same thing in football. It's so personnel and game plan dependent that I think that it's just something where the Vegas lines they definitely are correlated to production, but it really depends on the situation, and it also depends on the position, where certain positions like running back or kicker might be more correlated to the lines than players in the passing game.
One of the consequences, I think, of baseball being far more solved a sport, and I honestly think basketball is well on its way in that trajectory, given how much better the stats are getting, is this idea of ownership and differentiation that we've talked about before. And I think it really plays out differently across all of these four sports. I think with one consequence of baseball and or even mostly basketball and football having obvious sources of value, the backup getting heavy production, is that influences ownership. Golf doesn't necessarily, there's no such thing as a must play in golf, because pricing, when it's Vegas based, is so much more efficient to begin with. And there's no obvious, it's like, if a guy goes out, his caddy doesn't come and he's not priced at him in price, oh, he's going to get a heavy workload. So you have to think a lot more critically about ownership in golf. And I think there are all sorts of lessons learned. We bemoan weekly on the podcast about how the ownership of Jordan Spieth and Ricky Fowler seems to be inelastic and is always around 10-15% every single major. And there's some kind of standard narratives around, all right, popular players will have higher ownership. I don't know if that's necessarily true. Justin, is that actually true? Have you found week to week in basketball, can you count on Steph Curry when the Warriors are starting 25-0 as having 30% ownership because I like Curry? Or do you think people are more critical about different basketball?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit more nuance than just kind of chasing big names. And, in a Steph Curry 25-0 scenario, for example, they're blowing teams out. And, his fantasy point totals aren't through the roof compared to someone like a Westbrook or someone playing in kind of tighter games. I think there's, we talked about kind of must play guys and must values. I think that's a lot more commonplace in NBA than it is in NFL. There's not that very often where you have that minimum price guy who's going to step into a huge workload. It doesn't happen that often. And I think, kind of a pricing, a nuance, a wrinkle in NBA that's kind of specific to it is that pricing is a little bit slower to change, and you have these value guys. If a player is hurt for 2 weeks, it might take FanDuel, week 10 days to really bump up a guy's price to where it should be. So that guy continues to be a value play for a week straight. In NFL, they're a lot more aggressive with their pricing from week to week. If there's a guy who just had a big game, you'll see, a similar, or he'll see the price bump that he should have. And I think that kind of adds a little bit of a dynamic to NBA where it is a little bit harder definitely to construct really contrarian lineups, since there's such clear value on a lot of nights.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I kind of think about okay, well, what's the applicability to football here? Is there still – I'm sure when DFS was first starting out, there was the big name factor. And maybe when casual fan money was a bigger part of the pots, then, people gravitate towards the big names. Do you think that's – I wonder how it's going to be for this season. I assume players are getting sharper because the services are getting better out there. But what opinions do you guys have on are people going to get differentiation? What's the state of the metagame? Are we fully away from big people chasing big names and Odell Beckham having 50% ownership every week, or is it still going to be that way because there's just so much that the DFS so growing sport?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and to me, I think that it's very dependent on stakes. So if you're playing a 1K, for example, the ownership is going to be, it really is, especially in NFL, drastically different than what we see in a $3 or even the Millionaire Maker, where you can definitely be more value based in those lower stakes. And I think actually want to be more contrarian. And in some ways, it can be, depending on your style of play, it's not necessarily more challenging at higher stakes. It's just a different game based on the way that people think.
Yeah, I think understanding the metagame absolutely is a skill. We have the Thunderdome and PGA, which I know Pete plays pretty regularly, and I think that is one of them. That's the highest level metagame you get in golf, and it is by far not solved at all. Case in point, they had the Olympic golf event this past week, and nobody in the highest stakes tournament, the Thunderdome, owned the winner of the tournament, Justin Rose. I think that alone, like you can say, like it sounds a little bit results oriented, but there's definitely been some anecdotal spots about the metagame isn't solved there. I think the rules apply absolutely differently at the highest levels in predicting ownership in NFL as well. I'd agree with that. I don't know if it's necessarily solved though.
You know, I have questions about sample size because I think some of the things that we're talking about are definitely tied in with sample size. For instance, pricing in NFL has to be more aggressive because of the smaller sample size. You have only 17 contests. You have only one contest per week. So let's talk about that. Colin, golf basically has, it seems like, year-round games, and it seems like it never ends and goes on forever until we die. NBA and MLB have much larger samples. What can we take from your primary sport that can help us navigate the NFL small sample?
Well, I think golf does probably have the smallest sample of the four. I mean, next outside of NFL, a given player will maybe only have 40 tournaments, or is effectively the same as 40 games, like in a rating period. So it's still more than an NFL. But what it does force you to do, and I think NFL is kind of first on top of this, is you essentially have to manufacture greater sample or greater statistical validity from smaller events. In the case of golf, it's not necessarily just like 40 tournaments like over the course of a year. It's 40 times at least two for like number of rounds. Some people are playing 4 rounds. So we're big on this kind of long-term adjusted round, like what is the average score over multiple rounds? And so that way you can kind of generate additional sample. Golf also has a luxury of when you see how someone does relative to the field, that gives you a lot better indication of, instead of just putting up, knowing that someone put up, 80 fantasy points at like the John Deere Classic isn't really helpful without knowing what's the average scoring condition, because some courses are easier than the other. I think NFL is well on its way to that, because a lot of the better metrics out there, yeah, sure, there are only 16 games, but each of those games has a lot more possession. So when you get down kind of like on either per possession, per drive metric, you're essentially generating larger samples. And I think deriving your metrics from there will give you the larger sample essentially that you're looking for. The other kind of, it's not quite related to sample, but it's more dealing with the fact that there's so little time to essentially change from, our preseason understanding of what players are doing to in-season. It's a slow shift. And there's kind of an open question about how heavily do you weight in-season versus preseason as the first couple of weeks progress. Golf really enforces that a lot because of something that John touched on earlier. It's the fact that recent form actually does matter. What we would normally dismiss as like the hot hand fallacy in NBA is actually true in golf. And so it essentially forces you to come up with a really good way of how do you weight recent versus long-term and get kind of a good time weighting curve. I think the analogous thing in NFL is understanding how to weight, like, what's your blend of preseason expectation versus actual results. And I don't necessarily know that time weighting is solved yet. I think that the first level, smart person thing to say is like, oh, small sample, wait it out. We don't know anything yet. How do you know if you're being too conservative in your weighting, though? There's some literature out there that said even bookmakers probably don't adapt fast enough as far as like early on in the season. And so I think we're almost at the risk of going the new anti-conventional wisdom is becoming the new conventional wisdom that's equally wrong. Like maybe we should get more aggressive in weighting like actual results. Justin, this is probably a problem that you get in NBA, like where it's kind of in between baseball, like where eventually like you hit equilibrium, but like how do you have you thought at all or tried to tackle like the weighting of preseason versus in-season as the first 10, 15 games start to roll in?
Yeah, and I don't personally subscribe to the hot hand fallacy. I think there definitely is merit though in recent performance in NBA heavily, because it's so minutes and usage and role based that certain times you have players in such great situations where they're being a lot more involved in the offense. And I'm not just talking, field goal percentage or shooting percentage or things like that can regress, just their overall role in the offense. I think, the way I kind of weigh preseason and in-season has kind of a lot to do from team to team. I think this, how much carryover there is from season to season, how new things are, how new the environment is. We look at a situation like Golden State or Chicago or these teams that just kind of revamped their entire starting lineup or added a significant piece in the offseason. I'm much more kind of willing in those situations to listen to what's going on in season than I am to kind of prescribe to what I kind of project on the preseason level. So for me, it's kind of situational a bit, and I don't think there's kind of a hard and fast rule to where it's saw what the right split is. Kind of when weighing the two together.
I think that's a really good point, actually, because I think one of those papers that says we don't wait recent enough, kind of like, I think we all kind of take it for granted how much roster turnover there is in NFL compared to every single other sport. Golf has none by definition. NBA has some. MLB has, like, even if it does have roster turnover, it's debatable as far as how much that might matters. They're probably let's take an NFL team, for example. Like, who do you guys think has like a lot more, like, on that kind of if you're taking that line, there probably are some NFL teams that had a lot more turnover that we should probably be like essentially weighting recent results more than a stable team. Who do you guys think fits the bill this year so far?
I mean, I think a team like the Eagles is a good example of an offense that's just going to change a lot. They obviously just traded for Dorial, but just losing Chip Kelly and the impact that can have on an offense, one person and how they dictate the pace is just massive. It's also really, really big for the opponent. If they don't run that same sort of pace, the opponent's players aren't go. The opposing offense isn't going to have the same number of plays. And I think that ties into something that Justin was talking about with NBA that's relevant in NFL is how much you weight in-season performance is really opportunity based in NFL. It really does depend on how much did this guy's situation really change recently. And I think I've been someone who has been too quick maybe to write off things as variance. Odell Beckham in his rookie years is a good example where I was just like, there's no way that this is a good player because of other sort of heuristics I was using about maybe wide receivers that he wasn't big, he didn't dominate in college, just things that pointed toward him maybe not being a great receiver, but he was so quickly dominant and I wasn't factoring that in. And that level of dominance and the fact that he was coming in and getting all these targets should have been that should have been weighted massively for me. And that's just something that I didn't do, but it really, I think, does depend team to team. It comes back to those opportunities a lot. And one thing you were touching on earlier about trying to sort of manufacture a sample size, I think that one way to do that is by looking at sort of like player comps. So we don't have a massive sample for one player, but we can get larger samples in NFL by looking at very comparable players, looking at using trends, for example, which I think has a lot of value in golf. And I think it has a lot of value also in NFL, creating just very comparable situations and looking at how those quarterbacks, maybe a quarterback who's a favorite of 6 points and has an implied total of 27 or whatever has done, and we can get a much larger sample to sort of sort that out. And then the last thing I would say is the samples are so position specific in NFL, so it's not really games, because a game for a wide receiver isn't the same sort of sample as it is for a quarterback who has maybe 5x the opportunities, or a running back, a workhorse running back who's getting more opportunities. And so I think how quickly we adjust to recent performance depends on the position, what position a player plays for that reason.
You're still muted, Justin.
Going back to Colin, I'll toss back to Colin after, but going back to my process of how I kind of manage the preseason and the in-season, I think for percentages and like efficiency for NBA, I look I'm less willing to kind of make those changes because I expect regression. When I do make those changes, it's usually when I see a player in a system, in an offense that generally creates more efficient looks, like the Warriors or the Spurs. Like you see like a guy like Marco Bellinelli, go to the Spurs, have a career high 3-point percentage, come to the Kings, you see a ton of regression in there. I think that matters a lot, the scheme, the efficiency of the looks. And what I'm more willing to change as season goes on is just like the peripherals, like the usage and the rebound rate and how a person kind of fits into the offense. That's kind of more what I'm looking at. When I'm looking at recent performance, I kind of want to look at more the why than the what. Why is this player improving or playing so well as of late? Is it just, hot shooting, or is his role within the offense after changing? Is his shot selection, is he taking fewer long twos and trading those for threes or something like that? Has there been, a shift there? So I think it really is kind of case by case. You kind of have to understand the system and the scheme within which a player kind of exists in and how he fits in, and you make your adjustments kind of accordingly based off of that.
Yeah, I think that the analogy definitely holds for NFL. It's basically it's opportunities times effectiveness, kind of in both cases. In basketball, it's usage rate times how good are they at like utilizing possessions. In NFL, it's something like how many targets do you get versus like on average like how well will you do on each of those catches as far as yards or touchdowns or any of that. And I agree, it is kind of like not both of those parts of the equation like should be like you should be willing to adjust those separately depending on different factors. Golf doesn't have a whole lot. I don't have a whole lot to add as far as like what I've like done from the golf. Everyone's generally trying to shoot really well all the time, so I don't have I'm not required to kind of break that down stuff. But I do agree that that's kind of like the two sides of a separate coin, and you should be willing to treat both of those almost independently in terms of what you're willing to adjust and when. Something like scheme, I think, matters arguably just as much in the NFL, and understanding like if people are getting increased workloads or roles or if they're changing, that's something that you can definitely like it's so you're not going to get the luxury of figuring that out over 30 games. So I think it almost requires you to kind of subjectively adjust and understand when that's going to change.
Yeah. Just really quickly, last thing I add is NBA. I feel like is similar to NFL in that it's such a team game. It's so holistic that one little change can have a massive domino effect across the board. So one injury to a shutdown corner, or even going back to Odell, you see him the Giants offense with him in and out. Just it's drastically different. They're so different. With him in there, the entire dynamic changes. So that can make it definitely more subjective and just a more difficult sport to forecast because of that butterfly effect.
Yeah, that's interesting. And kind of going off of one thing Jonathan had said earlier, kind of on the flip side of the Dorial Green-Beckham trade, I think the Titans are also pretty different than they were last year. You have Mariota developing another season, a new head coach, 2 new running backs. You have a rookie wide receiver who looks like he's going to get a lot of action. Last year's, presumed kind of stud in the making is now on a different team. That should be a really different situation. Let's talk about positions, kind of positional breakdown. Obviously, golf, there is no position. There's just you hit the ball. Everyone's the same. NBA, obviously, there are the different positions. MLB is interesting in that you have pitchers and batters, but you still have batters who are broken into different positions. But Justin, let's start with the NBA since I think that is closest to NFL. How can your sport help us think about positional production, allocation, scarcity, and pricing in NFL?
Yeah, this is the long-winded question that I actually had to prep for a little bit, and it's a little bit loaded, and I think we can collectively kind of parse through it. And I'll start with just a position by position comparison. I think really any comparison between NBA and NFL is a little bit imperfect, just for a practical standpoint because the nature of NBA, there's a constant barrage of like injuries and late scratches. And as a result, you oftentimes have like clear values at a position that affect how we view the dynamic of each position. But if we're kind of like assuming full health here, there's like definitely carryover in how I view each position from NBA to NFL. And I talked earlier about how minutes and workload are so crucial for both sports. So I usually look to pay up for that floor and guarantee. In NBA, I look to almost always pay up for a point guard who I know is going to have the ball in his hand constantly, who I know is going to be very involved within the offense, get his touches and whatnot. And for that in NFL, I look to running back. I think kind of the most diciest group of running backs is that like kind of next tier of guys that you're kind of like hoping is going to get enough workload or is like almost elite. That's really like the most dangerous group of running backs, in my opinion. So I generally, when I'm looking at running back, I'm looking to pay up for the elite guy, top tier guy who I know going to get the ball, going to get his touches, the Todd Gurley's out there, or you kind of go for the value plays. The clear value plays, the bargains at the position. That's kind of how I view point guard in NBA. I think if you're kind of making a comparison to like tight end in NFL, it's kind of like a feast and famine position. The mantra to Gronk or not to Gronk, that's always kind of the question at that position. You kind of see a similar kind of thing in NBA with like, wings and centers. And I like the center comparison a lot more because you have guys like top end centers. They not only give you kind of the foundation of like boards and blocks and whatever, but some of them also give you that, scoring potential on top. And it's not a coincidence that when you look at, NFL, the skill player that had the highest plus minus on DraftKings last year was Jordan Reed at, plus 9.3 over expectation. 4 of the top 7 leaders in DraftKings in average plus minus were centers last year. Pau Gasol, Karl Anthony Towns, Brooke Lopez, DeMarcus Cousins. So I think that kind of dynamic exists in NFL and NBA where you're kind of looking at these scarcer positions where the value is kind of more top heavy, where you're kind of looking to pay up and we can go from there. I think there's a lot more to kind of parse here, dual purpose, blended positions, stretch fours, running backs who like to catch the ball too. There's a lot more to dive into here. So I'll pass the baton along here.
Jonathan, why don't you go?
Yeah, I think it's much different in MLB where you basically have 2 positions. For fantasy purposes, you have batters and you have pitchers, and like Justin was saying, NFL has these positions and they're all very different. But there's also all of these different sorts of categories of players within the position. You have a quarterback like Cam Newton is dramatically different than someone like Carson Palmer, and the variance in their games is different because of how they score fantasy points. A pass catching running back is different than someone who's touchdown dependent. Same thing with maybe Jarvis Landry, whose average target depth is like 6 yards or something, versus Vincent Jackson, who might be like 17 yards. That's just they're completely different players, and you don't have that in baseball. And then the opportunities that Justin was talking about in football can change so much based on players and based on positions, and it's not that we don't have that in baseball. Just because the guys have to hit in order and there's only one pitcher out there. The one thing I'd say is that as far as salary cap allocation, I think there is merit to paying up for the consistent position in baseball, which is your pitcher, and even potentially overpaying in certain spots and knowing that you're overpaying. Whereas in football, there's consistent positions, quarterback, running back being more consistent than pass catchers, for example. But I don't think it's an automatic thing where you're just paying up for quarterback or always paying up for running back. It changes based on injuries and opportunity, but it's a fluky enough sport overall that I don't think that that's necessarily a smart strategy, even though it's conventional wisdom that, okay, well, you need to start at running back and then you want to pay up for a quarterback in cash games. I don't know that that's necessarily the case.
Colin.
Man, you guys have a lot of thought put in this. All right, here's my positional analysis for golf. When you're picking someone at the golfer position, pick someone who does well. That's about it. Like that's So, like,
those were the hot takes I was supposed to come up with.
I know. So that's like, man, your guys' job's hard. I'm glad I don't have to do any of that. Like,
do you know what's interesting though? You can tell we know who good golfers are, right? We know who they are, or we certainly know a lot better than in other sports. We don't necessarily know who good football players are. We know obviously like Aaron Rodgers is better than Sam Bradford, but I think that outside of maybe like elite running backs like Jamal Charles and AP, who's better between say Doug Martin and Jeremy Hill and guys like Ryan Matthews? Like, who's a better player? We have no clue.
Yeah, like whatever you're using to measure objective value, the margin of error definitely outpaces like whatever granularity you have. So like there's almost like, yeah, there's no way you can know with certainty. I agree.
I'm going to jump the gun here a little bit, and Freedman might be a little ticked off because I'm going off script. But I want to pose this question because Bales hit on this a little bit just now, and I was curious about how obviously there are no hard and fast rules for roster construction for NFL. And given the differences in floor consistency between NBA and NFL, how does that impact the way you kind of put rosters together? Because, in NBA, you can have, 4 players, 5 players in a roster where you feel really confident, or at least pretty confident in the range of outcomes. You kind of know what you're going to get. And there's kind of an established floor there. Where NFL, just the nature of the sport and the scoring that puts so much emphasis on touchdowns, it kind of changes things, and it just adds to the variance. So how does that lack of a floor, lack of consistency impact your roster construction in NFL?
Yeah, I think that there are ways to we know ranges of outcomes for NFL players to some degree based on just like what type of player they are, how they score fantasy points, how many touchdown opportunities they're going to get. But I think that even if we know over a 10,000 game sample that this player like Antonio Brown's going to have access to a higher ceiling, even relative to his median projection than Jarvis Landry, there's so few games and it's so difficult to predict week to week that it just isn't as important as in NBA. Like Julio Jones in a great matchup could still have like 3 catches for 40 yards and no touchdowns. Russell with Durant out last year just like is an auto start, right? Like there's no way he's going to have 5 points or something. And so that's like a fundamental thing that completely changes how you compose your roster. And then in tournaments, and this is sort of the interesting thing, that cash games I think are more similar across sports because the volatility almost gets like evened out in a way. Like in baseball, the batters are so volatile, but it still doesn't matter. You still want to play those high value guys, right? And you're just waiting for the long run. It just takes longer to get there maybe. Whereas in tournaments, the metagame changes all the time. It's not what other people are doing matters so much that volatility, I think, doesn't really get factored out in the same way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I kind of struggle to balance for NFL and cash games, like the floor that I know of a guy's workload or running back's workload versus the overall variance of the position, and kind of balancing those two out. Like where do you kind of land on that scale? Like I
think part of the reason, like one of the things that golf kind of woke me up to is that I think there's also this inclination that floor and ceiling kind of have to be equal on both sides of someone's average projection. And for golf, I've definitely found that that's not the case. Like, for example, if cut making is a skill that's separate from upside, then it would stand that someone can have a really like high floor and low ceiling. But I think moving beyond those kind of assumed like symmetrical profiles is probably going to be some next level type of stuff for football, and it's definitely applicable from golf. Where those essentially linear, non-standard distribution come from, I mean, there's probably going to be a little bit more work to parse that out. Like, for example, there's nothing saying that, a high workload has to affect both floor and ceiling equally on both sides, or even a low one. But I think understanding where that kind of breaks down and where they're different is probably going to basically a more robust understanding of floor and ceiling and why they might be imbalanced is probably going to help with that. Like, okay, where do you balance it and where do you get that stuff from? So that's going to be the next level, I think, research that everyone's going to be figuring out.
That's really interesting there, because just thinking of this in terms of NFL, I think you can see the high floor, lower ceiling disparity in someone like Jarvis Landry, a guy who is going to get catches, going to get targets, not going to get a lot of touchdowns, or any other, kind of smaller receiver who steps into a situation where he's going to get targets, he's going to get 1,000 yards, but he's just not that big-bodied guy who's going to get targets in the red zone. You could see something like that also for those runners who get a lot of action between the 20, or maybe some guys who are pass catchers, but likewise don't get a lot of action near the goal line because someone like LeGarrette Blount comes in and gobbles up those touchdowns. I think you can see that disparity there. Guys, last real question here, and we're going to start with Jonathan. In every DFS sport, there are those factors or those metrics that seem more important than others or that provide an edge. What are those factors that are important that give an edge in MLB, NBA, and golf? And then how can we apply those, obviously, to NFL?
Okay, super simple question. In baseball, I'd say one thing that I've learned is understanding sample sizes and like what a really relevant sample size is and how large of a sample size is needed to draw certain conclusions. And then how we decipher and implement stats off of that, I think it really shows you how volatile NFL really is, and how much if things don't change with opportunity, how much we really can't trust even like a month of production. In NBA, I think that one thing that's really pivotal is like late breaking news and how that can impact roster construction. In NBA, it's a complete extreme where a guy can get scratched at like 6:50, like 10 minutes before lock or something, and he becomes an auto start, and you just have to have him in your lineup. We talked about auto starts a little bit in NFL with running backs, but we still do have those scratches, and especially for cash games and GPPs, it does affect lineup construction a lot. It's a really big deal to pay attention to that late breaking news. In golf, I would say maybe what I was talking about with talent evaluation. Like, we know for the most part who are good golfers, probably because it's such an individual sport. Like, they're out there more or less by themselves, whereas football is truly the complete opposite. It's very difficult to evaluate talent. And so for that reason, I think that it's position specific with maybe quarterback talent, the easiest to decipher and the most important. But an individual player talent probably matters a lot less than people think, and it's a tough pill to swallow, especially when you can come to pride yourself on evaluating talent. And that's something I used to really study the draft a lot and try to figure out maybe where teams were inefficient with picking these players. And I think there are a lot of inefficiencies. And the truth is that a lot of times it just doesn't matter that much because they play their top picks. They just give them way more opportunities, and you just can't make up for that that difference, no matter how talented you are. So that's something I think is really important, and a difference between golf and NFL.
Yeah. John, one of the things I think you hit on that I kind of did parallel research on is, the idea of in NFL, there's so few positions where we know talent effectively well. And I think one of the consequences is that in cash games, for example, you are okay with paying up for far more of a known quantity because uncertainty, like especially in cash games, for example, right? The less known of a quantity you are, the more risk that introduces, and you want to mitigate risk in cash games. There's an analogous piece where I did a whole long series of lineup reviews and evaluating the importance of like metrics beyond projections. And one of the surprising things I found for cash games in golf is that low volume players are far more risky for cash games. It seems like an argument every week about the latest hot rookie to start on tour. Right now it's Jon Rahm. Earlier this year it was Bryson DeChambeau. And Pete's usually a lot more bullish on the rookies because, it's a shiny new toy. They're fun things to play with. Whereas, I did back and looked over, a couple million lineups and said, those guys that are more of an unknown quantity, that is quantifiable, and that represents risk. So I think in NFL, it's the same. We're not only are different positions difficult to have a true measure of talent, but, it's not the same at every position. So I think there's a case to be made for paying up for a player that you're really confident on, and you're essentially how well do you know, are you either know exactly what you're going to get, and maybe that's just moving beyond. I think it's beyond just number of games played. I think it's just that's almost a subjective feel about when do you know that you can truly have a guy's talent level down. And I think there's that's a metric beyond just paying for high projected points. It's paying for certainty that is not necessarily even covered by floor and ceiling.
Yeah, I saw that. That was a really interesting article, and it's sort of risk and uncertainty are different things. And in cash games, at least from what you found, I think, and it makes sense that you would probably want to avoid both. In GPPs, you want to you can take calculated risks, but you don't want to take risks for no reason whatsoever. But uncertainty, when people are scared or just don't know, that's often they often avoid those situations, which can make sense in cash. But in tournaments, you do get the reduced ownership there. And so I think that understanding that difference is really important relative to what types of games you're playing.
Yeah, all of the stuff, I should have clarified, it was with a cash game ban, as far as you don't want any of that in cash. I completely agree.
I guess I can close this out with kind of just the NBA perspective and kind of continue what Bales was saying with the late scratches and such. And it kind of ties into what he was saying earlier with ODB and OBJ and the Giants. And, I think a lot of people make the false assumptions that, offenses and systems for NBA kind of stay the same when a player is scratched or a player is declared out. I think a big edge in NBA is related to kind of the on-off stuff and realizing how different an offense or a team performs without a piece in that lineup, and how it changes in terms of pace, in terms of quality of looks, in terms of efficiency. This is a team game like we highlighted earlier with NBA and NFL, and they're all pieces together. And I think it's important to kind of realize what is kind of noise, what's statistical outliers, and what is, system, what you can attribute to the system. And it's really important when evaluating players and kind of discerning whether their performance as of late is legitimate or just kind of a fluky blip. And for NBA particularly, I think, when you have 10 minutes, 5 minutes to make the snap decision, it's really important to kind of realize that nuance and be able to make these decisions and not just assume that, hey, the center who averages 12 rebounds a game, he's out. This new center is going to step in. He's going to average 12 rebounds a game too. There's this whole puzzle that you kind of have to sort through, and it's just kind of a domino effect, like it's been mentioned, where one player's absence just affects a whole host of others, just not his replacement.
I like that word puzzle because I think each sport is its own puzzle, and it really is something that needs to be even each slate is a completely separate thing, and you're just trying to figure out the best way to solve it in that particular day.
Guys, let's go around the table one more time for some closing thoughts. Colin, let's start with you.
I think one of the things I kind of want to look, it's not nearly as important as golf because it's tougher to piece together, is kind of the correlation effects and those non-linear interactive stuff. We get a little bit of that weather, with tee times, with groups feeding off of each other. But I think as much as I really want to get better at that in golf, mostly so I can apply it to NFL, I think it's kind of the cornerstone of a lot of roster construction. And I think really understanding those interactive effects is something that is definitely not solved in team sports like NFL and NBA. I am most excited to see what people are coming up with that this year and try to even glom on 10% of it to applicability to golf. So that's what I'm excited about most this year.
Justin.
Leave it to Colin to over-prepare for the closing statement. I absolutely had nothing prepared, I think.
I have no off switch.
I'm definitely excited for NFL season coming up. I think, one thing I'll be looking for and one thing we'll be focusing on at FantasyLabs is just kind of discerning stacks and stack ceilings and just kind of the ranges of these stacks. And I think that's becoming just kind of more in vogue with the QB1. Everybody knows about the QB1 wide receiver one, but kind of getting deeper into stacking and just kind of figuring out, the ranges and, which combinations are the most optimal, in each situation to take advantage of.
Jonathan, go.
So I mentioned that each sport is different and it's its own puzzle, but I do think that sort of what we've done here tonight is a really valuable exercise in applying principles from one sport, and not even just a sport, or even things outside of daily fantasy that you know about. There's a writer that I like named James Altucher, and he has this concept of idea sex, which is taking like one idea and applying it to something that's completely different and thinking about maybe the similarities and differences between those two things. And I think that that's just a really valuable practice. I think that that's something that everyone should do. And I think it's really, really valuable, particularly in NFL, just because the sport is so unique, and we have all week, and there's all this groupthink that goes on throughout the week. Everyone by the end of the week starts to sort of think in the same way, and approaching the game from a unique angle in every daily fantasy sport is immensely valuable.
All right, guys, great show. This I think might have been my favorite show so far. It was a lot of fun. We, of course, have been speaking with Colin Davy, Justin Phan, and Jonathan Bales. You can follow them on Twitter at ADJBaseline, JFan, and Bales Football. And you can follow me on Twitter at MattFTheOracle. I'm Matthew Freedman, and this has been the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable brought to you by FantasyLabs. Thanks for tuning in.